Welcome back, Year 3. This is the final video for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So in this video, we're going to be chapters 28, 29 and 30, followed by some questions at the end. So chapter 28, is Only Charlie Left. Which room shall it be next? Said Mr. Wonka as he turned away and darted to the lift. Come on, hurry up, we must get going. And how many children are there left now? Little Charlie looked at Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Joe looked back at little Charlie. But, Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left now. Mr. Wonka swung round and stared at Charlie. There was a silence. Charlie stood there holding tightly onto Grandpa Joe's hand. You mean you're the only one left? Mr. Wonka said, pretending to be surprised. Why, yes, whispered Charlie, yes. Mr. Wonka suddenly exploded with excitement. But my dear boy, he cried out, this means you've won! He rushed out of the lift and started shaking Charlie's hand so furiously it nearly came off. Oh, I do congratulate you, he cried. I really do. I'm absolutely delighted. It couldn't be better. How wonderful this is. I had a hunch, right from the beginning that it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie, well done. This is terrific. Now the fun is really going to start. But we mustn't dilly, we mustn't dally. There is even less time to lose now than there was before. We have an enormous number of things to do before the day is out. Just think of the arrangements that have to be made and the people we have to fetch. But lucky for us, we have a great glass lift to speed things up. Jump in, my dear Charlie, jump in. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. No, after you. That's the way. Now then, this time I shall choose the button that we are going to press. Mr. Wonka's bright twinkling blue eyes rested for a moment on Charlie's face. Something crazy is going to happen now, Charlie thought. But he wasn't frightened. He wasn't even nervous. He was just terrifically excited. And so was Grandpa Joe. The old man's face was shining with excitement as he watched every move that Mr. Wonka made. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high up on the glass ceiling of the lift. Charlie and Grandpa Joe both craned their necks to read what it said on the little label beside the button. It said, up and out. Up and out, thought Charlie. What sort of room is that? Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The glass doors closed. Hold on, cried Mr. Wonka. Then wham! The lift shot up straight like a rocket. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Charlie was clinging to Grandpa Joe's legs, and Mr. Wonka was holding onto a strap from the ceiling. And up they went. Up. Straight up this time, with no twistings or turnings, and Charlie could hear the whistling of the air outside as the lift went faster and faster. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe again. Yippee! Here we go! Faster! Cried Mr. Wonka, banging on the wall of the lift with his hand. Faster! If we don't go any faster than this, we shall never get through. Through what? Shouted Grandpa Joe. What have we got to get through? Aha! Cried Mr. Wonka. You wait and see. I've been longing to press this button for years. I've never done it till now. I was tempted many times. Oh yes, I was tempted. But I couldn't bear the thought of making a great big hole up in the roof of the factory. Here we go, boys. Up and out. But you don't mean, shouted Grandpa Joe. You don't really mean that this lift? Oh yes, I do, answered Mr. Wonka. You wait and see. Up and out. But it's made of glass, shouted Grandpa Joe. It'll break into a million pieces. I suppose it might, said Mr. Wonka, cheerful as ever. It's pretty thick glass all the same. The lift rushed on, going up and up and up, faster and faster and faster. Then suddenly, crash! The most tremendous noise of splintering wood and broken tiles came directly above their heads. And Grandpa Joe shouted, Help! It's the end! We're done for! And Mr. Wonka said, No, we're not. We're through. We're out. Sure enough, the lift had shot right up through the roof of the factory and was now rising into the sky like a rocket, and the sunshine was pouring through the glass roof. In 5 seconds, they were 1,000 feet up in the sky. You can see there. The lift's gone mad, shouted Grandpa Joe. Have no fear, my dear sir, said Mr. Wonka calmly, and he pressed another button. The lift stopped. It stopped and hung in midair, hovering like a helicopter, hovering over the factory and over the very town itself, which lay spread out below them like a picture postcard. Looking down through the glass floor on which he was standing, Charlie could see the small faraway houses and the streets in the snow that lay thickly over everything. It was an eerie and frightening feeling to be standing on clear glass high up in the sky. It made you feel that you weren't standing on anything at all. "Are we all right?" cried Grandpa Joe. "How does this thing stay up?" "Sugar power," said Mr. Wonka. 1,000,000 sugar power. "Oh, look!" he cried, pointing down. "There go the other children. They're returning home." Chapter 29. The Other Children Go Home. "We must go down and take a little look at our friends before we do anything else," said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and the lift dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. "I can only see 3, he said. "Who's missing?" "I expect it's Mike TV," said Mr. Wonka, "but he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the giant trucks?" Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. "Yes," Charlie said. "What are they for?" "Don't you remember what it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of sweets. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim." "Ah!" Mr. Wonka went on. "There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father." "You mean he's really all right?" asked Charlie, astonished, "even after going up that awful pipe?" "He's very much all right," said Mr. Wonka. "He's changed," said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. "He used to be fat. Now he's as thin as a straw." "Of course he changed," said Mr. Wonka, laughing. "He's got squeezed into a pipe, don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they managed to dejuice her after all. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks. Much better than before." "But she's purple in the face!" cried Grandpa Joe. "So she is," said Mr. Wonka. "Oh, well, nothing we can do about that." "Good gracious!" cried Charlie. "Look at poor Veruca Salt and Mr. and Mrs. Salt. They're simply covered in rubbish." "And here comes Mike TV," said Grandpa Joe. "Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and as thin as a wire." "Oh, they've overstretched him on the gum stretching machine," said Mr. Wonka. "How very careless." "But how dreadful for him!" cried Charlie. "Nonsense," said Mr. Wonka. "He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now," he added, "it is time we left these 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie." Mr. Wonka pressed another button and the lift swung upwards into the sky. You see all of the children as they leave the factory. Chapter 30. Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass lift was now hovering high over the town. Inside the lift stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused and turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared round the corners of his eyes, and he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire chocolate factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I'm really giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him!" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who's going to run a factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take it over from me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try and do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious sweet-making secrets while I am still alive." "So that is why you sent out the golden tickets!" cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner." But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "do you really and truly mean that you are giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie? After all—" "There's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass floor at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's that little cottage right on the edge of town, the tiny little one." "I see it!" cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons, and the lift shot downwards towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," Charlie said sadly. "Why ever not?" "Because she won't leave my Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George." "But they must come too." "They can't," said Charlie. "They're very old, and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years." "Then we'll take the bed along as well, with them in it," Mr. Wonka said. "There's plenty of room in this lift for a bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door." "You mustn't despair," cried Mr. Wonka. "Nothing is impossible. You watch." The lift was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "I'm going right on in to fetch them," said Mr. Wonka. "How?" asked Grandpa Joe. "Through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the lift, right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed, and each one of them thought that the end of the world was to come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, and Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the lift. "It's only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it. And he's given it all to me. And, what are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried poor Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." You see the state of their house now. "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again anyway." "Who is this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "Could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself." It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day, and even then they all refused to ride back in the factory in the lift. "I'd rather die in my bed," shouted Grandma Josephine. "So would I," cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the lift. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button, and the doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed, and the lift rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof, out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the 3 old people, who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see." Okay, that's the end of the book. We finished it all. Fantastic. So we've got questions to answer. Question number 1. What button did Mr. Willy Wonka choose in the elevator? Number 2, where did the elevator go? Number 3, what power keeps the elevator in the air? Number 4, What did each child take home with them from the Wonka factory? Number 5, what did Mike Teavee look like when he left the factory? Number 6, what did the Salt family look like when they left the factory? Number 7, how was Augustus Gloop different when he left the factory? So you can compare him before and after. Question number 8, what did Violet Beauregarde look like when she left the factory? Number 9, why did Willy Wonka leave his chocolate factory to Charlie? Number 10, what happened to Charlie's house and how did his parents feel about this? And number 11, how did Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe get the bed and the old ones to the chocolate factory in the end? And finally,